thin, irregular whimper trembled across the dry riverbed and stopped. The man halted where the sand dipped, listening for the sound to return. It came again, soft as air, leaking from a reed, then fell under the scratch of wind, moving seed pods along the dust. He crossed to a buckled raft of thorn where an old flood had folded branches into a tangled roof. Beneath the grey spines and sunburned grass, a small body lay pressed to earth. At first, it seemed only a shadow. Then a ribcage rose and sank, and a narrow flank showed a dried streak of blood. One forepaw was tucked under at a wrong angle, the pad gritted with sand. He went to one knee, lowering himself the way a person does when quiet matters more than time. Heat shimmered over the riverbed, turning the far bank unsteady. The cub blinked with slow, dragging lids, pupils wide, the colour dulled by light and thirst. Flies gathered at the wound and lifted as the man flicked his wrist in a small, patient gesture. He searched for signs of the mother before anything else. Nothing fresh showed in the powdery sand, no round, certain print that says lion is passing, no half-moon set deep by a recent run. Close to the thorns, a narrow drag line cut the dust and disappeared under the collapsed brush. The cub gave a breathy chuff, more air than voice. One ear tipped and fell again, his whiskers trembled. The man unrolled a strip of cloth, wet one corner from his canteen, and held it to the small tongue. The response came slowly, but it came, a swallow, then a faint push of the muzzle toward dampness, then stillness. He waited between touches, letting the body decide. "Easy," he whispered, no louder than the wind under the grass. The thorn canopy had locked itself into the cub's coat, making a stiff lattice. He slid the cloth between spine and fur, lifting one branch at a time. Some spines had only tangled, others had pierced through. Each time the cub tensed, ribs fluttering under skin. The man stopped and let stillness fold back around them. When he moved again, he did it with a sideways turn of the wrist so nothing came straight or sharp. The forepaw would need care, but not here. A long thorn had entered near the pad and vanished. Pulling it blind would risk breaking it off inside the flesh. He chose a compromise, wrapped the paw lightly so pressure softened, but blood still moved. He tore a thin strip from the cloth and laid it with 2 careful passes, nothing binding tight. The cub flinched, then quieted, eyelids lowering as if weight had eased by the smallest measure. He checked the shallow scrape along the flank. It was more abrasion than wound, the kind a body collects while thrashing to be free. He cleaned the edges with a dampened corner of cloth, not rubbing, only touching and lifting away grit. The smell of the cub was dust, old milk, sun. Bones stood close beneath the hide like thin rungs. Evening drew long, turning thorn tips amber. If the lioness lived, she was not near to call. The man did not test fate with noise. He let the place speak the little it would say and kept his hands steady. He eased more branches aside. The heap had fallen in a way that pinned the cub by weight rather than a single anchor. He widened an opening until the stiff stems could rest without collapsing back. When the last thick piece lifted, the cub's body showed its true size, small enough to carry, heavy enough to tell that milk had been recent until it wasn't. "Almost," he said, an edge for the quiet to rest on. He did not lift yet. He slid his jacket beneath the cub so the first shift would be on to fabric, not sand, and waited. The cub's chest rose in quick, shallow strokes. The tail made a brief, uncertain twitch and went still. When the man slid his hands under the jacket's corners and shifted him an inch into a clean patch, the body accepted the change without fight. He paused, listening. Insects, wind, a distant clank of cattle bells from beyond the reserve's boundary.
nothing else. He set the canteen near his knee and pooled 3 drops in the crease of his palm. The rough tongue rasped once, again, and stopped. Too much water on a hot, emptied stomach could harm more than help. He offered only that, and waited. The cub's breathing steadied from frantic to thin and regular. Once a hitch ran through the ribs and shook the whole small frame. He let it pass, the light thinned further. A vulture circled east, unhurried, but drifted away. He thought of what he did not see, no fresh prints of a pride, no scrape marks from a recent kill, no scuff of urgent running close by. Absence sketches its own story. He did not chase it. He examined the paw again. The wrong angle remained, but the joint felt whole beneath his fingers, tendons stringing true under skin. The thorn would sit near the pad and could be taken out where there was light and clean hands. The cub breathed through his nose in short pulls, then longer ones that eased the tightness along the ribs. Between them, the sand settled. The jacket took the imprint of the little body, warm through the cloth, light where the spine touched. The man shifted so that his shape did not block the wind's path, keeping scent from flowing toward the open plain. He looked once toward the horizon and once to the thicket behind, not searching, only knowing where edges lay. Crickets began. A bat sketched the boundary of their pocket of stillness and was gone. The first star showed and held. The man drew a sling from his bag and opened it beside the jacket, measuring the lift he would need when the time came. The cub watched the motion without lifting his head. He waited for the heat to ease another fraction. He waited for light to soften the ground. The cub dozed in small pieces, waking to swallow, sleeping again with his mouth barely open. When he shifted the cloth near the muzzle to leave the nostrils clear, the cub nudged the damp and stilled. A tiny, economical use of strength that said enough had been given for now. He studied the line of the ribs once more, the way breath met limit and returned. He studied the drag line that had disappeared under the thorns and how small grains had already begun to fall back into themselves. The place repaired, even as it recorded. In that balance, the choice of the next hour took shape. Careful, slow, quiet. "It's okay," he said, almost to the dark. They marked only the rhythm the man chose to keep. He slipped one hand beneath the jacket and waited for any tremor of refusal. None came. He slid the other hand under, felt warmth, felt the fragile, stubborn weight of a life that had not let go. When he lifted, he would do it in one smooth motion and hold until the body settled. Not yet. The plain still held too much glare. Night would make the open ground a calmer road. In the last smear of daylight, the riverbed let go of its edges. Thorn became rope. Sand went the color of ash. Cooled by a narrow degree, and the smell of dust turned clean, almost sweet. The cub slept for a handful of breaths, woke for 2, and slept again. The man measured that, and the small, steady lift of the chest before him, and knew the path he would take when darkness finally settled. He gathered the sling in his hands and watched the little ribs move. The day thinned to blue, then to a grey that asked for quiet. He breathed once for steadiness. The cub's ear flicked once at the faint clatter of a beetle, then fell to rest. Dust settled back into old patterns as if the world were making space for what came next. Slashes in the soil began as faint interruptions, a set of parallel grooves cut by something dragged with weight and purpose. They climbed the low bank away from the riverbed and turned into a harder patch of ground beneath sparse grass, then vanished, then appeared again where wind had not smoothed them. The man shifted the sling against his chest so the cub's ribs would not press at a single angle. The small body was warm through the canvas, breath steady but shallow, a light rise and fall that brushed the cloth. He studied the grooves a long moment, memorizing their direction, then followed. A collapsed shrub caught the moon's pallor and looked like a heap until he reached it and saw the snare. The wire loop had tightened on nothing in the end, but a smear of dried blood darkened one twist, the color gone to rust. Grass around the anchor point was threshed in a circle where something had fought and broken free. He crouched to the level of the wire and saw how it had been set, low, along a natural funnel between thorn and ground, placed for a neck that would pass without noticing. The metal held a smell like old rain and iron. The knot was practiced. Boot prints pressed in near the snare's stake, heavier at toe than heel, as though the person had leaned forward to test the line. The edges of the prints were still firm, not yet softened by wind. He measured the length from heel to toe, the spacing between steps, the way grains had rolled off each ridge. 2 sets, one larger, one lighter, and a third partial, crossing at a different angle. He let the prints tell him the time, hours, not days. He scanned for tire marks, but found none here. Perhaps they had left the vehicle farther off. Beyond the snare, the ground turned to a scuff of dry needles under acacia. The drag marks reappeared in short bursts, as if the weight had been lifted and set down again. He searched for the round, firm shape of a lioness track and found only fragments, a partial pad, the suggestion of a toe, nothing full enough to hold. The cub in the sling shifted and gave a soft, breathy squeak that was neither protest nor comfort, only a sound that meant he was still present. The man placed his palm lightly over the sling for a moment, not pressing, just reminding the body that it was held. He moved along the line where signs persisted, lifting each foot with care so no twig snapped under his weight. The night smelled of dust and old sap. Far out on the plain, a hyena called once and ceased, as if thinking better of it. The boot prints angled toward a patch of bare earth that had been scraped clear of grass. Here he found tire tracks at last, narrow, hard-edged lines crushed into the crust, one set overlaying the other with the slight sway of a vehicle that had turned, paused, and then turned again. A feather lay broken near the tracks, barred and grey, the quills split. He turned it in his fingers and set it down. The scrub thickened where the path narrowed between 2 thorn stands. Something had been dragged through this choke point, too large to pass cleanly. Twig ends were polished where they had scraped against smooth hide or plastic. The man thought of bait, of how handlers sometimes lash a carcass to draw in scavengers and predators alike. He looked for feathers again and found 3 more, in a line, each broken, each caught at a height that said they had snagged on the same shoulder as it went through. The cub slept in a shallow way that kept waking to swallow, then fell back into little silences. He checked for any sign of the mother once more. Where the path widened, he found a single, clearer print. The front pad of a lioness set at an angle, the outer toe deep, the inner barely showing. The stride did not repeat where he could see, as if she had turned into brush and left no clean path. He knelt and placed 2 fingers in the hollow. The sand held a trace of heat from the day, no warmth of its own. He rose without letting the print crumble. A line of ants cut across it, silent and undecided. Past a low rise, the land levelled into a corridor of combretum and sere grass. The vehicle track skirted the edge of the reserve boundary, keeping a parallel course as if whoever made it knew where patrols passed. Here the boot prints returned, moving away from the vehicle and toward the interior. The steps were set with a long, unhurried stride, suggesting a routine. The man studied the shape of the tread, a chevron pattern with one broken notch. The other set had a smooth heel, worn down, common enough, but notable all the same. He marked these differences in mind like landmarks you carry without looking. He took water on his tongue and swished it, then let one small measure wet the cloth again. He pressed it to the cub's lips and waited. The response came with a brief, instinctive roll of the tongue, one swallow, then another, then nothing. He drew the cloth away and let air pass over the muzzle. The sling's strap cut at his shoulder. He shifted it half an inch and the pressure eased. He breathed slow because it helped the body under his hands keep its rhythm. The ground opened to a stretch of pan flat enough to mirror the sky if there had been water. In the center of the pan, someone had left a heap of poles lashed together, the kind used to stake a blind or brace a net. One pole had a fresh scrape where a blade had cleaned its end. The smell of oil hung faintly, not strong enough to travel far, strong enough to persist. He set his foot on the pan's edge rather than cross open space, preferring the line where grass meets hard earth, the line where signs collect. A low shape ahead resolved into a bird tied to a length of cord, wings folded, eyes dull. It had been used and released, or used and forgotten. It hopped once, then stilled, feathers puffing against the chill. Its tether loop had cut a groove in the sand where it had moved in small arcs over hours. He knelt, slid the loop free and set it beside a bush where a passing wind would not drag it. The bird watched with a flat, sideways look and did not attempt to fly. He left it without ceremony because lingering would not change its calculus in the night. He found more tire marks past the pan, a pull-out where the vehicle had reversed and then gone on. A faint dribble of fuel darkened one patch. The smell was cold and metallic. The man counted a distance in his head, guessing how far to the outpost if he kept this bearing, how long the cub could go between sips where cover would lie if headlights came into the plain. He did not hurry. He moved in the kind of measured way that adds distance without announcing itself to anything that listens. The poaching route, once seen, grew obvious, a nervous thread threading known gaps in thorn, bending around termite mounds, crossing dry channels at their shallowest points. He followed it only long enough to be sure of its direction, then left it for the softer edge, where his own path would draw less attention. The cub woke and made a sound that broke before it became a cry. The man dipped his head and let his voice cross the short space between them. "Easy, little one." It applied to the cub and to the night itself. Wind travelled over the grass in long, even passes. He listened for the shape of engines and heard none. Once he stopped and put his hand to the ground. The earth held only the mute tremor of insects moving, nothing larger. He angled toward a stand of taller thorn where he could rest and take stock without silhouette. The sling creaked, a dry, soft sound. He leaned against the rough bark so the cub's body would be held between living wood and living chest, and there would be no sense of empty air beneath. The decision was not a moment, but a settling of what had already arranged itself, the mother's absence, the freshness of the prints, the direction of the route, the cub's condition. He could not work both trails, on the one that pursued men and the one that preserved life, without losing both. The outpost would have what the small body needed, and people who could take the other path with more eyes. He checked the binding on the injured paw, saw no bleed-through, and left it in its loose wrap. The cub's ear flicked once, twice, then lay flat in a way that said sleep had come again. He moved on, choosing dark ground over bright, brush over bare. A scrub hare dashed close and vanished into his own small tunnel through weed. Fluorescent beetles winked and went dark. A jackal barked from far off, not toward them, not away, only declaring itself to no one in particular. He passed a broken fence line that had long since been mended farther north. The old posts stood like ribs against the horizon. Between two of them, he saw a new stake, driven and removed, leaving a deep, crisp hole that said, "Today." He memorized it without stopping. The land dipped, then climbed to a shallow ridge where the wind ran unhindered. From there the dark smoothed itself into one long plain, broken by a scatter of trees. He pointed his steps toward a marker only people who knew this place would recognize, the thin silhouette of a windmill that turned even on nights like this, cutting the air with a patient, three-winged rhythm. The outpost sat below it by the tanks, not close, not far, reachable if he kept his measure, and nothing demanded he break it. The cub pressed a little harder into the sling, and the man shifted his arm so the body could lie with more length. Breath warmed his shirt through the cloth. He could feel each small exhale like a moth beating twice and resting. He thought of the earlier print of the lioness and let it sit in the back of his mind without weighing decisions he had already made. He thought of the broken feather and the wire and the chevron print that tilted, and knew each detail would matter when he returned with others. A faint light moved along the far edge of the plain. Not a headlamp, but a ranger's torch, too distant to be called to, too far to call to them without carrying sound where he did not want it. He watched it for a count of 30, saw it pause, then trace a slow arc and vanish behind a stand of trees. The rhythm of his steps remained steady. He took no comfort from it and felt no fresh worry. It was information, like the smell of oil or the slope of ground underfoot. He skirted a place where the surface had been churned by hooves. A small herd of antelope had passed recently. He could tell by the softness of the edges and how the top layer had cracked but not yet collapsed. Their presence meant nothing hunted in the immediate moment. It meant only that the world continued its small math while he did his. He crossed their tracks diagonally so as not to make a straight line for a nose to follow. Then the wind shifted, sending the scent of water from the tanks in the distance, clean and metallic. The blister in the sky that had been the moon thinned behind like cloud, and the land grew friendlier to anyone moving without wishing to be seen. He straightened a little, not to hurry, only to ease the long curve that the sling had written into his back. The cub stirred and gave a tiny, questioning click inside his throat, a sound so small it tangled with the rasp of canvas. "Almost there," the man said, the words quiet enough to fall before they could travel. He walked until the windmill's rotation took on a rhythmic whisper, a sound the ear could sort from all other sounds without thinking. The outpost would be below the next fold of earth, guarded by its own darkness and the ordinary noises of a place at night. A hinge settling, a bucket knocking an empty tone, a sleeping thing changing sides. He did not picture it because pictures waste what the body needs. He kept to the course he had chosen, carrying the small weight that slept and woke by turns, and letting the ground bring them to where water and hands could finish what resolve had started. The savannah closed around them in slow layers of sound and shadow. Night had fallen with a softness that hid edges but carried everything the grass could hold. The man stepped between stems that reached higher than his shoulders, each one stiff with the dryness of a season too long without rain. They brushed his arms and whispered together, a constant murmur that disguised his passage if he moved gently enough. The sling across his chest was warm with the body it carried. The cub's breathing fluttered against the canvas, then steadied, then shifted again, as pain moved under the skin like a restless thought. The sky above still held a wash of grey where the horizon refused to surrender its last light. Crickets rose in steady rhythm, weaving into the rasp of cicadas. A nightjar called once, a clipped note, then silence. The cub shifted.
His hind legs twitching as though a dream had carried him briefly into movement, but the injured forepaw remained stiff, curled into its loose wrapping. A small whimper broke free, high and unfinished, like breath cut short. The man stopped at once. He bent his head toward the sling. The cub's muzzle pushed faintly at the cloth, then fell back with a slow sigh. The man waited, knees flexed, body still enough that his own heartbeat seemed to press against the silence. When nothing else stirred, he eased forward again. He kept each footfall to the flat edge of earth, where no twig lay hidden, pressing the ground slowly before shifting weight, making the step a glide rather than a strike. Far ahead, beyond the wall of grass,
A faint light moved. It was too steady for fireflies, too orange to be starlight. It flickered, stopped, then shifted again with the irregular rhythm of a carried torch. He narrowed his eyes not to strain for detail, but to fix the location against the sky. The light was too far to reach, but too near to ignore. Whoever held it was travelling along one of the narrow paths poachers used, the same ones he had avoided. He drew a breath through his nose, let it out slowly, and adjusted the sling so the cub's weight would sit deeper against his chest, muffling any sound. The torchlight flared once, illuminating a brief outline of a tree trunk, then sank as the bearer dipped behind scrub. The man moved on, each step patient, deliberate. The cub gave another sound, not loud, but sharp, carrying further than it should have in the open hush. A single, thin cry. He froze. The savannah went still as if listening. No answer came, only the low breath of wind moving across the tops of the grass, bending it in ripples that passed overhead like a river flowing in air. He waited until the ripples had travelled their length, and silence fell again. Then he shifted his stance and walked, keeping the same steady measure, refusing to break into haste. The grass opened briefly into a small clearing where an aardvark's dig had left a shallow pit. He crossed it at the narrowest point and paused in its cover to listen again. Somewhere distant, the torchlight reappeared, fainter now, veiled by distance and the roll of the land. He could not tell whether it was moving closer or away. He glanced to the cub. The small body lay curled with its muzzle tucked near its chest. Breath moved the cloth in shallow lifts. The cry had spent itself. He poured a few drops of water onto his fingertips and touched them to the cub's lips. The tongue flicked once, gathered the wetness, then fell still. The man withdrew his hand, wiped it against his thigh, and adjusted the sling again. A whisper passed through the grass as he stepped back into the tall cover. The stalk swayed and closed behind him, leaving only a narrow line of parted stems where he had gone. The ground grew softer underfoot, the earth broken by burrows and the faint prints of antelope. He slowed, feeling with his toes before lowering weight, careful not to collapse the edges of holes. The cub shifted again, pressing his body against the man's chest, small ribs rising in uneven cadence. Each movement was a reminder of how fragile the thread between strength and collapse could be. Above them the stars widened, filling the sky where cloud had pulled back. A pale band crossed from horizon to horizon, cold and unblinking. He kept his eyes on the grass ahead, but let his ears chart the sounds. The scrape of an insect wing against stalk, the distant bark of a jackal, the low rustle of something four-legged passing far to the left, too far to threaten, too near to ignore. Each sound carried its own measure of distance and direction, a map drawn in darkness. The torchlight flickered once more, higher now, perhaps on a rise. He bent lower, reducing his outline, and pressed further into the cover. The cub shifted with the motion, a faint grunt escaping his throat. The man laid his palm gently against the body through the sling, steadying it without pressure. "Hush now," he breathed, softer than the wind. The cub quieted, settling into the warmth of his chest. Step by step, he worked a path that curved away from the light. The grass grew denser, its stems creaking as they brushed one another, the sound masking the faint movements of his passage. He moved as though part of the rhythm, letting each pause of wind become his pause, each rush of sound his cover to move. The sling shifted with him, and the cub's breathing steadied once more. Time stretched without measure. The light behind him dimmed, then disappeared entirely, leaving only stars above and the restless hum of night insects. He did not quicken his pace. The land demanded patience, not speed. A misstep here, a sudden noise there, and all the distance gained would vanish. He kept his course angled toward the windmill silhouette he had marked earlier in the day, unseen now but fixed in his memory. The grass began to thin, giving way to scattered patches of bare soil. He knelt in one of these, resting briefly. The cub stirred again, pushing against the sling. The man opened the cloth slightly, letting air pass over the small body. The cub's eyes opened a fraction, dull in the starlight, then closed again. He touched the cloth with 2 fingers, a gesture of reassurance, then covered the body once more. When he rose, the land felt quieter. The air had cooled, carrying the smell of dust mixed with faint sweetness from night-blooming flowers. Far off, a hyena called again, answered by another, their voices stretching across the plains. The cub did not stir at the sound. The man stepped back into the rhythm of movement, each step considered, each pause measured. At last, he crested a low ridge. The grass fell away on the other side, opening into a plain cut by faint tracks of antelope. From here, the sanctuary outpost lay somewhere beyond the fold of land, still far, but nearer than it had been. He stood for a moment, letting the wind carry over him, and listened. No torchlight, no engine. Only the constant murmur of grass and the faint exhale of the small life pressed against his chest. He adjusted the sling one final time and began down the ridge, the cub's weight firm and steady, the night holding its breath around them. Each step carried them further from danger, deeper into the silence of the grass that had hidden them and guided them through. The outpost came into view at first as nothing more than the dark silhouette of a windmill against the night, its blades turned slowly. Creaking a rhythm the land had known for decades. Below it, faint light glowed from the veranda lamps of the sanctuary building, softened by the mesh of insect nets strung across the windows. The man approached with measured steps, the sling close against his chest. The cub was heavier now in weariness, his breathing a shallow flutter that still held its rhythm. At the gate, one ranger rose from his chair. He saw the sling, saw what it carried, and opened without a word. The man passed through into the compound where earth was packed flat by years of boots and wheels. A dog stirred under the veranda, lifted its head, then lay down again. Inside the main room, where light burned steady and low, the vet waited. The cub was set gently onto a clean blanket, his paws flexed weakly, pressing at the cloth as if searching for ground. The vet crouched close, hands sure but not hurried. She parted the fur behind his ear and stilled. A pale scar ran in a thin curve beneath the skin, nearly hidden by new growth of hair. The edges were neat, stitched with human precision, months old. "This one's been handled before," she murmured, not quite to anyone, her brow drawn tight. The man said nothing, only shifted to let the light fall clearer. The vet traced the scar with her fingertip, then examined the ear's base. Underneath, she found a faint mark, almost invisible. She rose, crossed to the cabinet, and brought back a handheld scanner. She passed it slowly over the cub's head. A soft tone answered, a code appearing on the small screen. The room grew still. The vet tapped the code into her register. Her eyes narrowed as a line of text returned, then another. A name, a number, a history. The cub was not anonymous, not newly found, not simply orphaned by chance. He belonged to a line traced and monitored for years. He was the offspring of Nia, a lioness recorded as missing nearly half a year ago, presumed dead after patrols found signs of conflict near a waterhole. Her prints had ended where Poachers' tracks began. No carcass had ever been found. The vet exhaled through her teeth and set the scanner down with care. "Nia," she said softly. The word held both recognition and weight. The cub stirred faintly at the sound of voices, pressing his muzzle against the blanket. His injured paw remained wrapped, his body stretched, as if seeking warmth he no longer had the strength to create. The man poured a shallow dish of water, dipping cloth into it again. He let a few drops touch the cub's lips. The tongue flicked once, then again, drawing small strength. The vet reached for her logbook and began to write, recording the discovery in slow, neat script. She noted the scar, the tag, the condition. Her frown remained. "If she's alive," she said quietly, "she'll be looking for him." The man looked to the door, to the land beyond the sanctuary fence. The night lay open and unbroken, but his thoughts traced the paths he had walked, the drag marks, the snare, the flicker of torchlight. Somewhere among them, perhaps not far, a lioness moved. The vet cleaned the cub's wound with iodine, dabbing carefully around the paw. The cub flinched, but did not resist. She set a fresh bandage, firmer than the cloth, but not binding too tightly. Then she checked his ribs, counted his breaths, pressed her stethoscope against the narrow chest. She nodded once, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. "Weak, but sound," she said. He was stabilized, at least enough for rest. She mixed a thin formula of milk substitute and filled a dropper. Holding his head gently, she fed him in small measures, letting him swallow at his own pace. Each drop seemed to cost effort, yet each was accepted. His throat worked, his body shifting with the rhythm of trying. When he had taken all he could, she laid him back onto the blanket. His eyes opened briefly, dull gold, clouded with exhaustion, then closed again. The man remained standing, one hand resting against the edge of the table. His shoulders eased slightly, though his gaze stayed fixed on the cub. The vet finished her notes and straightened. "This isn't just rescue," she said. "This is lineage." The name Nia carried memory. She had been one of the few surviving lionesses of her line, known for ranging wide across the reserve's southern reaches. Rangers had tracked her movements for years, watching as she led small prides through seasons of lean and seasons of plenty. Her disappearance had struck a heavy note, the kind that does not fade quickly. And now here lay her cub, scarred once by human hands, scarred again by abandonment and capture, but alive, alive, which meant a chance, alive, which meant the mother might still walk the same land. The vet placed the scanner back into its cradle and shut the logbook. "If she lives, she'll come," she said. Her tone was neither hopeful nor certain, only factual. Lions do not abandon what they can reach. A mother who had already survived poachers would not leave her cub if life remained in her body. Outside, wind rattled the corrugated roof. The dog stirred again and settled. The man adjusted his sling, now empty, folding it neatly on the bench. His shirt bore faint marks where the cub's claws had pressed, small arcs in the fabric. He brushed at them once, then let his hand fall. The vet dimmed the lamp and left only the lowest light near the cub, so his rest would not be disturbed. The blanket rose and fell with each fragile breath. The room smelled of iodine, milk, and dust. Silence gathered again. The man stepped out onto the veranda. Beyond the fence the savannah stretched, endless and unseen in the dark. Somewhere out there, if the records were true, a lioness searched. If she carried breath in her lungs, she would know her cub was missing, and she would not stop until she found the scent. He leaned against the rail, the night pressing cool against his skin, and listened. No torchlight now, no footsteps, no wheels. Only the long, steady pulse of crickets. Behind him, the cub slept. Ahead of him, the land waited. The truth had shifted. This was not just a rescue, but a reunion waiting to be written in the quiet language of the wild. 3 days had passed, each one stretched long by waiting. The cub had grown stronger in small, almost imperceptible measures. A steadier breath, a deeper swallow, a faint twitch of paws when sleep carried him through hidden places. His eyes opened more often now, still clouded by exhaustion, but glimmering faintly when light caught them. The vet measured his progress carefully, never rushing, never speaking in tones above what the moment allowed. The man remained close but not intrusive, moving as though the space belonged first to the cub and second to anyone else. On the third evening, dusk folded itself over the sanctuary with the same unhurried rhythm it had carried for centuries. Crickets sang from every patch of grass, their notes weaving into one long chorus. The windmill turned slowly above, groaning a familiar hymn into the fading light. The man stood near the outer fence, his hand resting against the metal as the horizon deepened into shadow. That was when he saw them. New tracks pressed into the soil where none had been the day before. They were larger than the cubs, wider than any stray dogs. 4 pads, clear and certain, the edges still sharp with freshness. A lioness. He crouched to examine them. The ground still held the faint moisture of a recent dew, and the prints had settled into it not long ago. He lifted his gaze across the plain, letting distance blur, searching for the shape that matched the signs at his feet. Movement stirred beyond the grass, slow, deliberate. A form stepped into view, outlined against the thinning light. She walked with care, favoring one leg slightly, gaunt in the flanks, her ribs showing the long price of hunger. Yet her head remained high, her eyes sharp, searching forward with a focus that had not dimmed. The man stayed still, his breath slowing with hers. The lioness paused within sight of the fence. She lowered her head and lifted it again, tasting the air. Wind carried scents across the mesh, and in that moment, something changed. Her body stiffened, her ears angled forward, and a low, guttural sound escaped her throat. Not warning, not anger, but recognition, searching for answer. Inside the pen the cub stirred. He had been lying in a shallow sleep, his paw still bound, but his breathing steadier than before. At the sound his head lifted weakly. His ears twitched, his nose worked, and then a small, broken whine slipped from his chest. It was not strong, but it carried. The lioness froze, then stepped closer, her body now taut with certainty. The vet came to the gate, eyes narrowing, movements slow. The man joined her.
and together they watched the lioness draw nearer, each step measured, deliberate. Dust clung to her fur, scars mapped her shoulders, but her gaze never wavered. She halted just beyond the gate, close enough that the iron smelled of her breath. She exhaled in a low, steady huff, waiting. The cub answered with another whine, this one higher, sharper. His body shifted, dragging itself toward the scent, his muzzle pressed against the fence. His small tail twitched once, then again. The lioness leaned her head close, her nose brushing the air just beyond the wire, and gave a deep, resonant rumble that trembled the ground more than the air. The vet's hand rested on the latch. She glanced at the man, but he did not speak.
He only inclined his head slightly, his jaw set. Together they eased the gate open. It creaked once, the sound thin in the dusk, and then silence again. The lioness did not surge forward. She stepped slowly, deliberately, as though every pace required trust. Her paws pressed the ground with care, leaving deep, certain prints that trailed behind her into the compound. She moved toward the cub and lowered herself at his side, folding into the dust as if she had always belonged there. The cub pressed his head against her flank, his small body trembling in effort. She bent her muzzle to him, touching her nose to his fur, breathing him in as though confirming what her ears and eyes already knew. He gave a tiny mewl, softer than the sound of insects, and then stilled, his breathing matching hers. The man stood back, his hands loose at his sides. For a long moment he let his chest rise and fall, with the quiet around him. Then, as the two lions settled into one another, his shoulders eased. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, soft and silent. No word was spoken. None was needed. The wind passed over the compound, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass. The sky above dimmed into violet stars, waking one by one. The lioness closed her eyes, her body curled protectively around the cub. Their breathing, once ragged and separate, moved now as one. The man turned his gaze back to the fence, to the open land that stretched beyond. Somewhere out there, dangers still walked. Men with wire and torches, roots hidden in the tall grass. But here, for this dusk at least, life had returned to its rightful place. He did not step forward, did not intrude. He only stood, the quiet image settling into him like a mark that would not fade.